In one human lifetime, China poured more concrete, laid more track, and built more factory floor space than most civilizations managed across several centuries. It pulled hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. It became the workshop of the planet, the place that makes the batteries in your phone, the panels on your neighbor's roof, the ship that carried your last online order. None of that was fake. It's one of the great economic stories in human history. But here's the thing about every economic story, it's also a financial story. And financial stories always end with a ledger. Somebody built the road, somebody lent the money for it, and sooner or later somebody has to pay it back. Welcome to Learning Financial History. Today we're not asking whether China is collapsing. People have been shorting that trade for 30 years and losing. We're asking a more useful question. Who picks up the tab for the fastest industrialization in world history? Rewind to 1978. Is picking through the wreckage of the Mao years, and he makes a strange bet: keep the Communist Party in full political control but let markets, foreign capital, and private incentive do the economic heavy lifting. Not capitalism, not central planning, something stitched together from both. The starting ingredients were almost unfair. A massive, disciplined labor pool, rock-bottom wages, a culture of extreme saving, and a state willing to build the port before a single container ship asked for one. Foreign manufacturers showed up because China was cheap. They stayed because China became something rarer, complete. Not just a factory that assembles a product, but an entire ecosystem that makes the screws, the resin, the circuit boards, the packaging, and the trucking network to move it all inside a 100-mile radius. That's not a wage advantage. That's a coordination advantage, and almost nobody else on Earth has built one at this scale. Here's the crack in the foundation, and it was there from the start. Chinese households saved an enormous share of their income because the state safety net, healthcare, pensions, unemployment was thin and unpredictable. People built their own safety net out of cash. That created a strange trap. The banking system needed those savings to fund all the building. But the more families saved, the less they spent, so growth had to come from construction, exports, and infrastructure instead of ordinary household consumption. And nothing absorbed savings like an apartment. For a Chinese family, a home was never just a home. It was a retirement account, a dowry requirement, a citizenship badge, and most of all, a bet that tomorrow's price would beat today's. With capital controls blocking money from easily leaving the country, weak returns on bank deposits, and a stock market that behaved like a real estate felt like the one asset you could actually see and touch. So the machine assembled itself. Local governments sold land use rights to developers to fund their budgets. Developers borrowed against that land and pre-sold apartments before pouring a single foundation. Buyers took out mortgages on homes that existed only on paper. Rising prices made every link in that chain look solvent right up until they stopped rising. By the late 2010s, Beijing could see the speculation running out of control, families owning 3, 4, 5 apartments not to live in but to park money. In 2020, regulators imposed the now famous 3 red lines, forcing developers to cut leverage before taking on new debt. The policy was sound in theory. In practice, it revealed something uncomfortable. The entire sector had been running on the assumption of endless refinancing. Cut off the new money and the towers stopped rising. Became the poster child, a developer that had scaled by selling homes years before finishing them, expanding into side businesses and betting the whole structure on sales never slowing down. When credit tightened, the dominoes went over. Suppliers went unpaid. Buyers kept paying mortgages on apartments that weren't finished. And here we are in 2026, still watching the aftermath play out. Recent national data tells a blunt story. New home prices across 70 major Chinese cities were still falling year over year in the spring of 2026. The 35th consecutive month of decline, the longest losing streak on record for the modern index. Resale prices have fared even worse than new build prices, with private data from mid-2026 showing second-hand values down close to 40% from their peak in some major cities, and inflation-adjusted price levels nationally back below where they stood 2 full decades ago. Property investment fell by double digits in the first months of 2026 alone. There are pockets of calm. Shanghai and a handful of top-tier cities have actually posted small annual gains, as wealthy buyers treat premium urban property as one of the few safe harbors left. But that's the exception proving the rule. Everywhere outside the very top tier, the bleeding continues. A reasonable outsider might ask, the state controls the banks, so why not just order a rescue? Because Beijing can rescue an institution far more easily than it can rescue a belief. It can extend a developer's loan maturities, and it has, reportedly letting banks push out repayment on stalled projects by up to 5 years. It can direct trillions of yuan in financing toward unfinished buildings, and it has, with loan whitelist programs already clearing more than 7 trillion yuan for stuck projects. What it cannot do is make a young couple believe that the apartment they're eyeing will be worth more next year than it is today. And if the state reflates the old machine too aggressively, it just resurrects the same disease. Unaffordable housing, speculative buying, overconstruction, and developers who assume the government will never really let them fail. So Beijing is threading a needle, engineering what amounts to a slow-motion, controlled deflation of the property sector, rather than either a full rescue or a full collapse. Estimates from major banks suggest the property slump alone has been shaving roughly 2 full percentage points off China's annual GDP growth in recent years, a drag policymakers hope to gradually shrink toward less than 1 point by the end of the decade. That is the plan. It is also, by definition, years of pain distributed slowly rather than concentrated fast. Land sales didn't just fund developers, they funded local governments' entire operating model: roads, transit, schools, hospitals, salaries. When developers stopped bidding aggressively for land, that revenue line didn't shrink, it fell off a cliff. Local governments had also been borrowing heavily through off-the-books financing vehicles to build infrastructure, some of it transformative, some of it built for a political target rather than genuine economic need. A subway line might serve a city for 50 years. The bond that paid for it still needs a coupon payment every quarter, regardless of ridership. The result? A wave of local governments now leaning on spending cuts and asset-backed borrowing against whatever state property they still hold, just to keep current obligations serviced. Take a step back and China's core imbalance becomes obvious. It is extraordinarily good at producing things and much less good structurally at getting its own citizens to buy them. Falling home values erased a chunk of household net worth almost overnight. A shaky job market, especially for young graduates, makes people cautious. The safety net for healthcare and old age is still thin. So instead of spending, households save even harder, which, in a slowing economy, tips toward outright deflation. Prices drift down, consumers wait for a better deal, businesses cut margins to compete, wages stagnate, and debts, fixed in size, get harder to service against shrinking income. That's not a story about factories. It's a story about frightened consumers. So what does China do while property and consumption sag? It leans harder into manufacturing, electric vehicles, batteries, solar, shipbuilding, robotics, advanced electronics. And this part isn't hype. Chinese EVs are genuinely competitive, its battery technology is close to indispensable to the global energy transition, and its shipyards are taking a commanding share of global orders. That creates a split-screen economy, factories running full tilt, households sitting on their wallets, exports climbing while property keeps sliding. And when a country produces more than its own people will buy, the surplus has to go somewhere, which is exactly where a domestic financial imbalance turns into an international trade fight. From Beijing's chair, this build-out looks like insurance, technological self-sufficiency after watching Washington restrict access to advanced chips. From Washington's and Brussels' chair, it looks like state-subsidized overcapacity flooding their own manufacturers out of the market. The answer on that side is tariffs, local content rules, and export restrictions of their own, which pushes China further towards self-reliance and even more industrial investment. The loop doesn't break, it tightens. Layer in the population maths. China's has been shrinking since 2022, the tail end of decades of the one-child policy plus the soaring cost of raising kids in expensive cities. Fewer future workers, fewer future buyers, more strain on pensions and elder care per working adult. That quietly kills one of the oldest assumptions behind the property model, that more people will always keep arriving in the cities to fill new apartments. A home in a growing city is an asset. A home in a shrinking one can turn into a maintenance bill nobody wants to inherit. Young people feel this hardest. China built an enormous higher education system, and families spent fortunes on tutoring and exams to get their kids into it, only to find the economy generating white-collar jobs slower than it's generating graduates. Delayed careers mean delayed marriages, delayed home purchases, delayed spending, a slow leak in future demand. Every discussion like this eventually reaches for Japan's 1990 bubble. Property and stocks collapsed, and Japan spent decades in low growth and mild deflation. There are real parallels: asset bubbles, aging populations, heavy saving. But the comparison has a hole in it. Japan hit its wall as a wealthy country, an established U.S. ally at the technological frontier already. China is hitting its wall while still comparatively poor on a per-person basis, still racing to climb the technology ladder and increasingly framed as Washington's primary strategic rival. Japan slowed down after getting rich. China is trying to avoid slowing down before it fully gets rich. That's a harder trick, and it's tangled up with geopolitics in a way Japan's story never was. None of this means China is out of tools. The state can move capital fast, spread losses across the banking system over long stretches of time, and lean on genuinely deep industrial and engineering capacity. Home ownership in China is unusually high by global standards, and most households own their homes outright, a shock absorber that limits, though doesn't eliminate, the risk of forced selling. But control isn't the same as immunity. The state can delay a reckoning or spread it thin or dull the sharpest edges. It cannot make a bad investment good again. It cannot make a debt vanish. And it cannot manufacture household confidence with the same tools it uses to manufacture steel. The real challenge in front of Chinese policymakers isn't reviving the old property machine. It's replacing the job that machine used to do, generating local government revenue, storing household wealth, and giving families a reason to spend rather than hoard. That means shifting income and resources toward households and away from investment and industry, and that kind of shift rarely happens without a fight over who loses out. China's old model wasn't a failure before this. It was a triumph that built real ports, real railways, and real industrial muscle. But that triumph was financed on the assumption that tomorrow would always be bigger than today. Tomorrow is still coming. It's just arriving slower than the promises made in its name. Some of the bill gets paid through lower home values, some through leaner local budgets, some through bank losses quietly absorbed over years, some through weaker growth, and some inevitably gets exported through cheap goods, trade surpluses, and rising friction with the rest of the world. Debt can pull a future forward, it cannot cancel the invoice. China built the future in record time, now it's finding out what that future actually costs. If this helped you see the story differently, subscribe to Learning Financial History, because behind every miracle there's always a ledger.